everything I've worked on my whole life gets constantly blamed for the decline and fall of journalism. So the internet, everybody knows, right? The internet has completely destroyed the news business. The internet has destroyed journalism. The democracy is in peril, and it's all my fault. So at a certain point, I start to get and on behalf of all the people I worked with to build things like the web, it's like, okay, maybe it's not the new technology's fault at a certain point. So my observation is, and then I think it's a very interesting topic. So I think and I focused on the news business because that's kind of the pointy end of the spear in terms of the thing that people are most worried about. I look at it as I do what very few people have been willing to do, I think, which is look at it purely as a business and basically say, and so here's my basic position is our view of what the news business is and of what journalism is an artifact of a specific period of time from 1945 basically 1945 to 2005, and basically post-war U.S. If you go back to the news business before World War II, if you start in colonial days, and if you extend all the way up through the 1930s, the news business worked very differently. It was a very successful business, and it was a lot of people were in it. A lot of people made a lot of money. But like as an example, this whole idea of objectivity that journalists now take as kind of this kind of pure concept that has to be maintained. Like there was really no such thing. Like I always say, objectivity is an artifact of an era in which news businesses were monopolies or oligopolies. In the days when news businesses were fully competitive, subjectivity was how it went. And they always say, you're a scumbag. How can you say that? And I'm like, well, Ben Franklin was a subjective journalist, and so stop calling Ben Franklin a scumbag. He actually knew what he was doing. He was actually a very successful journalist, a very successful publisher. There's a great book on the news business in the colonial era in the U.S. called Infamous Scribblers, which is what was a pejorative at the time for reporters, which could come back into fashion. It's a great articulation of how the news business actually grew up in the U.S. And then in the 20s and 30s, it got really interesting with figures like Hearst and Pulitzer. And so you can actually study kind of the historical news business kind of through those two time periods. And then you kind of look at post-World War II and you say, well, what happened? Well, monopolies and oligopolies got established. And so it was sort of this era of centralization in a lot of parts of the economy, but it was very clear in the news business. You'd have one major newspaper per metro area because of the cost of distribution. You'd have, 3 TV networks nationally because of the limited bandwidth for VHF TV. You'd have, a handful of local radio stations. You'd have a handful. You'd only had a handful of magazines. You could only really have 3 general news magazines on newsstands because you just couldn't afford to distribute more than that. Scale economics kind of ruled the day. And so the news business went into this mode where they kind of said, okay, we're a monopoly. We're a monopoly or an oligopoly. And if you're a monopoly or an oligopoly, it's incredibly important to stay out of antitrust trouble. And the best way to stay out of antitrust trouble is to not make anybody angry. And the best way not to make anybody angry is not have any opinions. And so therefore, let's be objective about everything. And then we can just basically say, First Amendment, objectivity, don't break us up. And that worked really well as long as the distribution was controlled, which it was. The distribution was locked down. And then the internet showed up. And then the internet basically took the legs out from under all the distribution monopolies, and then all of a sudden there are millions of voices. So my point as a business person is, okay, that's the past. Like that's the old days. That's over. We need to look back to what happened when these things weren't monopolies and oligopolies. We need to look back to the 30s and 20s and back to the colonial era, and we need to basically think about how to build news businesses and media businesses that thrive in a competitive market. And that has to do with being, incredibly aggressive. That has to do, in many cases, with having a very strong point of view. It has to do not with the idea that you're going to be the only point of view, but you'll be one of many, and you have to argue things out. You have to have the right cost structure. You have to think about market segmentation, and you have to do all the things that people do when they actually build businesses. The issue in the news business is that a lot of the executives in the business did not grow up in a competitive market, and so they just don't know how to do that. So now what's happening is the new entrepreneurs like Jonah Peretti at BuzzFeed or Sarah Lacy at Pando or the folks who built, you see a lot of this in the tech industry, TechCrunch and all these things. A lot of these new things, or what Pierre Omidyar is doing with First Look, is you're getting now very smart people who are coming in from outside with very fresh points of view, building very exciting things. And all the traditional journalists are like, oh yeah, that doesn't count. But healthy business, healthy journalism. You have to get to healthy business before you get to healthy journalism. And so then you look at market size and you basically say, well, how big is the market for all this stuff? And it turns out the market for news is gigantic and is growing very fast because so many people are becoming part of the modern world and so many people are getting access to information for the first time. And so the global market for news is going to be 5 billion people within 10 years. And everybody needs to know what's going on. And so the market's going to be large. And so I think there's huge opportunities for market growth, but it's going to be from companies that are able and that are willing to compete.